David Kinane here. Today we're going to look at ambiguous language, including homophones, homonyms, and homographs. When we're looking at these things, what we're talking about is ambiguous language. Now, any lawyer will tell you that words and sentences can be ambiguous. And in fact, many contract lawyers wouldn't have a career if language was always clear. Obviously, if there are ambiguities in something that's been said or something that you've read, you're likely to have problems understanding it. And not all ambiguities can be easily eliminated. To understand language, you need to understand each of the words that you hear, what they mean, in other words, the vocabulary. You need to understand utterances or sentences when they're on their own. A good example of this is when we're following instructions or listening to instructions. We need to be able to understand them in context. And the third area is we need to be able to understand connected speech and to read texts, so groups of sentences or utterances together. For example, to understand a story or a description. We need all three of these things if we're going to build a mental picture of what we're being told or what we're reading that's accurate. So words can be ambiguous, and the three main categories are homophones, homonyms, and homographs. They're often confused, so I thought I'd spend a second just defining what each is. Homophones are words that sound the same but have different meanings. They can be things like bear and bear. Homonyms are words with the same spellings, the same pronunciation, but multiple meanings. So words like fan or bank or mouse. Now, some purists believe that a true homonym is where both meanings of the words have different word origins. But for the purposes of today, we're going to use it more loosely to refer to words with the same spelling and pronunciations, but multiple meanings. And homographs. These are spelt the same way, but have different pronunciations. So words like wind and wind, tear and tear, read and read are good examples of these. And these are often sentences that we might have to, these often appear in sentences where we might have to do a double take and read them twice to understand which one's being referred to. So homophones and homonyms are really common in English. So I pulled up the 200 most common words spoken in English by adults. And as you can see, there's just heaps of them. So the capitalized member of each of the pairs here is the most common word. It's the most common one meant. But as you can see, right from the get-go, we have heaps and heaps of words that are homophones in English. There are also heaps of homonyms in the top 200 words. And again, this is just a really quick rundown. And using our loose definition of homonym, you can see that we've got just heaps and heaps of them that we use all the time. Now, more classic definitions of homonyms tend to focus on nouns, and there's a really great list in the Norbury 2005 article that I list at the end of this talk of some really common concrete nouns that have two meanings, sometimes more meanings. And we'll be looking at some practical examples of these as we go. So most homonyms have a dominant meaning and a subordinate meaning. So in the Norbury study, she found that when most English children heard the word jam, they thought of the conserve, the strawberry jam or blueberry jam that we kind of spread on bread. And they're less likely to think of jam referring to the traffic jam. Now, interestingly, and it kind of shows how culturally things can be different, if you were to run this study in the US, I'd imagine you'd get a very different result. And in fact, I would imagine that many US children may not have access or may not know the second meaning of jam, meaning conserve. So it just goes to show that it can be a bit cultural. And when I was reflecting on this, I think there's also a generational influence too. So I was quite surprised when I read Norbury's study to see that most young children in England, when they hear the word mouse, their first or dominant, or the dominant meaning of that for them is the computer mouse. Now, it's probably because I predate the computer mouse, but I always think of the small mammal that squeaks when I first hear the word mouse. So that was really interesting. And it just goes to show that the meanings of words and the relative importance of meanings of words when they're homonyms can change over time and may vary by culture. So we also have ambiguous sentences. And so when we hear a sentence like, "The man hit the boy with a stick," it's a very unfortunate sentence, but it'll do for the purposes of this example. There's two possible meanings. Did the man hit the boy who happened to have a stick, or was the boy hit with a stick by the man? We don't have enough information with that sentence alone. And if we were given that, we would need more information to resolve which of those meanings is correct. In fact, there's a whole group of people who've gone about their lives looking at so-called garden path sentences. And these are sentences that are super ambiguous and are notorious for confusing readers by sending them off track. So I've taken a couple of classic examples here of what are called garden path sentences. And I've had very educated people read these sentences and tell me that they're not grammatically correct. I'm here to tell you each of these sentences is grammatically correct, but it takes a bit of thinking to figure out how it is that the sentence is grammatically correct when on a first reading it doesn't work at all. So let's look at the first example. The old man the boats. Now, most people, when they read that sentence, see old man as a noun phrase. So they've got a mental picture of an old man in their heads. But actually, the author of this sentence meant man to be a verb, to man the boats. So what he's saying is that the old are said to man the boats. Hopefully that makes sense. The next sentence is also difficult for similar reasons. The complex houses, married and single soldiers and their families. This is a sentence that took me a while to figure out when I first read it. And I did what most people do, which is to read complex houses as a noun phrase. But again here, houses is actually a verb. So what this sentence is actually saying is that married and single soldiers and their families are housed in the complex. The complex houses married and single soldiers and their families. Now the words are pronounced in the same way, but the intonation is different. And the use of the word houses is different from what we expect. The last one is another classic garden path sentence. And again, it took me a while to figure out. Fat people eat accumulates just seems like a bunch of words, not a sentence. But if you read it as the fat that people eat accumulates, it makes more sense. Ambiguous, it's confusing. People have to spend a lot of time understanding what they mean, but still grammatically correct. These are extreme examples of ambiguous sentences, but they're good illustrations of how even people with really big vocabularies can have problems understanding words when they're put in sentences that are, I guess, not what you're anticipating or not what you're expecting when you first read them. So let's now talk about ambiguous language and language disorders. So, not surprisingly, many children with language disorders have difficulties understanding ambiguous language in context. Some researchers, particularly, I guess, in the early 2000s, put forward the idea that difficulties processing ambiguous words and sentences was in some way linked to ASD, that it had something to do with the cognitive processing style that we often see with people on the spectrum. But particularly Norbury's study, but also the studies that followed it, suggest that actually what's more important is the structural language ability of the child. So regardless of whether they're on the spectrum or not, the question is whether they have a language disorder that includes structural language problems. And what we find is that children with structural language problems understanding and producing complex syntax, for example, have a lot more problems resolving ambiguities regardless of whether they're on the spectrum or not. So in other words, it's the language ability that seems to be the most important thing. I hasten to add, of course, that there is not consensus on this point, but it certainly makes sense to me, probably because I'm a speech-language pathologist and I've seen children with language disorders who are on the spectrum and who are not on the spectrum both struggle with some of the ambiguities that we're talking about today. So the obvious question is why? So many people with language disorders have difficulties processing ambiguous words and sentences, and there's a few reasons that different researchers put forward for explaining why this happens. So the first, and probably the most obvious, it's probably one that most listeners to this would have immediately thought of, is poor vocabulary. If you don't know the meanings of a word, you're going to have problems understanding it, and you're going to have even more problems if the word that you're reading or listening to has more than one meaning. So for example, if we're looking at bow, meaning bow and arrow, and bow, the thing that you tie around your neck, kids with language disorders tend to make a lot more errors, particularly with the subordinate or less known meaning of words, which suggests, not surprisingly, that they may not be familiar with less frequent alternative word meanings for some words. If you can't activate the relevant meaning of the word when you hear or read it, it's going to be obviously very hard to understand it. And it can also be very distracting if you've got the wrong picture in your mind. And we're going to come to that too. So the second reason is syntactic or syntax processing deficits. If you don't have a good grasp on typical word order and common sentence structures, you might have difficulty knowing whether, for example, the word that's spelt T-E-A-R refers to the verb to pull something apart, or to the noun referring to a liquid secreted from the glands in a person's eyes. In other words, tear or tear. For example, when you read a sentence, the girl wiped the tear from her cheek, or did you see the boy tear his shirt? My knowledge of the sentences, my understanding of the meanings of the words help me determine how to pronounce tear or tear. And sometimes you'll get more ambiguous sentences. So for example, her eye had a tear in it seems to be the more likely of the meanings, but it is of course possible for people to get tears in their eyes. So that could have been the meaning too. So that can be very confusing for people. Some people may know what all the words mean in the sentence, but have difficulties integrating them with the other information in the sentences. And that seems to happen an awful lot to children with language disorders. So another thing that can happen is obviously having difficulties processing at the discourse level. And by discourse level, we're talking about connected speech, we're talking about conversation, we're talking about stories, we're talking about recounts, we're talking about language that isn't just single sentences, it's connected. So I came up with an example here of once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a cottage on the edge of the forest. One day, she decided to visit her grandma, who lived in a log cabin on the other side of the thicket. Now, some people may not recognize that the words once upon a time are used to signal a fairy story, so they may not be in the mode of kind of accepting that they're hearing a story. They may think that you're telling them something that's literally true. The listener or reader may not know that the she in the second sentence of my story starter refers to the girl in the first sentence. I'm surprised how often that happens still, that some kids tend to read each sentence as almost like an island unto itself. And I particularly notice this when kids have some decoding issues where they're actually having to work hard to get the words off the page. But some children with oral language issues, even if they have no problems reading the words on the page, still don't make the connection that the she in the second sentence refers to the girl in the first sentence. The other thing that can happen is that the listener may just not build a mental picture of the two small houses, one on each side of the forest. That was in my mind when I put this little story together, courtesy of Little Red Riding Hood. And this can be compounded if they're a bit sketchy on some of the vocab. So if they don't know what a forest or cottage or a thicket or a cabin are, it can be difficult for them to have the same picture in their mind as we're trying to convey when we write a story like that. Another thing that can pose problems is difficulties suppressing irrelevant information. So let's use our example of a mouse that I was talking about before. If you hear a sentence start with "the mouse," you may initially activate two ideas. Now, I've put them in the order that I activate them, which is different from young English children, it seems. But when I think of that, I think first of a small mammal that squeaks and eats cheese, and secondly, of a peripheral device used to move the cursor about when I'm typing on a laptop. If the sentence concludes with "ate the cheese," I'm going to suppress the computer-related meaning straight away, and I will have in my mind a very clear idea, probably of a white mouse, the type that you see, in the media in particular. If the sentence continues with "stopped working because of a driver problem," I will suppress the mammal, and I will switch across to thinking about it as a computer mouse. But if the sentence concludes with "was lost," both meanings may have to stay activated pending further information. And when I do that, I still favour the squeaking mouse pending further information. But it seems like other children, particularly younger children, may actually err toward the dominant meaning being the computer mouse pending further information. Some people with language disorders may have difficulty suppressing the incorrect meanings of words. So, for example, when children are given a sentence like "the man fished from the bank," and then they're shown a picture of a financial institution, in other words, a financial bank, children with language disorders take longer and make more mistakes in identifying that that picture is actually irrelevant to the sentence they're provided. So in other words, they're focused more on the word than on the sentence, and that can be a real problem, particularly when you're looking at connected speech and texts and stories and so forth. Another problem that's been put forward, many children with language disorders have particular difficulties with verbs. Verb difficulties are often a hallmark of children with developmental language disorders, and often the verb in a sentence provides a lot of context for the meaning of an ambiguous noun. And in some researchers talk about the verb constraining or dictating the meaning of a sentence. So, for example, if I have a sentence like "I dug with the spade," most people will immediately go to the image of the garden tool that you dig with rather than, say, the ace of spades, largely because of the verb dug. It doesn't make sense to use that verb if we're talking about a suit in a deck of cards. Many children with language disorders have difficulties learning new verbs and may not be as sensitive to how verbs control the meanings of sentences. So if that's an issue, then I spend a lot of time, as I do with most children with language disorders, working on verbs and how the function of objects can be linked to the objects to build a deeper understanding of what the object means. And in previous little talks on figurative language, we've spent a bit of time talking about the need to build deeper connections between words and things that are related to the words, like function. Another thing that's been put forward as a difficulty for many children with language disorders is reduced memory for sentences. So another test that's very sensitive for the existence of a developmental language disorder is a child's ability to hear and repeat sentences, particularly long and complex sentences. Most children with language disorders have great difficulty with these tasks, and obviously if you've got a reduced memory for sentences, that's going to make it more difficult for you to understand ambiguous language in context, particularly in connected speech and reading passages. So there's lots of different reasons why this is tough for children with language disorders and tough for them to resolve ambiguities that you or I might not think are particularly difficult to resolve. So how can we help children with language disorders and other people who have problems with homonyms and homophones and homographs? Well, I guess I start from the point that I think explicitly teaching high frequency and functional homophones and homonyms is a really good idea. When I'm doing that, I'm targeting semantic knowledge. So I'm teaching both the meanings, or if there's more than two meanings, all the meanings of the words, and that can help. I'm also targeting complex syntax, including complex sentences, sentences with multiple verbs, sentences with relative clauses, sentences where the word order doesn't necessarily match the order of events, passive sentences, all of those types of complex syntax examples that we know children with language disorders have difficulties with, but for the purpose of helping them to identify ambiguous language and to resolve ambiguities in language by understanding the sentences. So Jacobson and her colleagues suggested a 7-step plan. First, reading or listening to a text that contains 5 to 10 ambiguous curriculum appropriate words. I think it's always a good idea to start from the top down, start with a passage rather than working from the bottom up. It just seems to be more efficient when you're trying to help kids work out ambiguities in meanings. Second, visualizing the meaning of ambiguous words. And I often do this with really primitive stick figure sort of drawings that sort of show the difference between, for example, wind and wind. 3, identifying different parts of speech within sentences containing ambiguous words. So explicitly teaching kids how to break down where is the subject, where is the verb, where is the object, what's a noun, what's an adjective, what's a preposition, what's a verb, all of those types of things. 4, then categorizing the words, so actually sorting all the ambiguous words into their respective parts of speech. And again, I'm looking at nouns and verbs and adjectives and pronouns and conjunctions and all the different parts of language where we can have homonyms and we can have homophones. And then 5th, analysing the word meanings in context. So this is often done with giving kids a passage with missing words in it and having them sort of fill in the right word that goes in the space. Then taking ownership of the words, so actually having word lists, having a personal dictionary of difficult words, writing the words in sentences. And 7th, extending and evaluating new meanings. So using things like cards and matching the cards to sentences and generating sentences with the words yourself. So actually formulating your own sentences using the difficult words can help deepen the meaning of those words for a child with a language disorder. Pryles suggests making up some homophone decks of cards and playing card games. I don't hate that idea. I think that it can work. But again, remember, we're looking to work on these words in context. And so I'd always want to see things at least at the sentence level, ideally at the discourse level if I could. Choosing the right words is obviously important. And I'll talk a little bit about how I choose which words I focus on and why in a second. If you're looking to teach these words, you want to make sure you're using evidence-based methods for helping children to map and to learn and to use new words. I've got a link there to a blog where I sort of outline how I do that in therapy. And finally, context is probably the most important thing. Just like most figurative language we've talked about in the videos to date, putting things into context and bringing them alive is really important, particularly for children with language disorders, but in fact for all children. So putting the words into sentences, stories, recounts, procedures, all of the types of things that we are expecting children to do in upper primary and certainly secondary school are really important. In my own work with children with language disorders, I tend to have a big bias toward choosing words that are used in the curriculum. So I don't go for words that kids are not going to get multiple exposures to. I'm going to go for words that I hope they're going to hear a lot. I try to target what are called Tier 2 or academic vocabulary. These are words that are used at school right across the curriculum and right across subjects. They don't tend to be super specialized words. They don't tend to be very obvious, concrete words. They're right in the middle, which is why they're called Tier 2 words. And I also try to pick up on commonly confused words, in part because they're so frequent in English, and can send kids off in the wrong direction if they're misinterpreting what the words mean. But also because when it comes to writing, when kids make errors with these words, things like there and there and there, it tends to lead to a perception that the child's writing skills are less developed than they might otherwise be. And so making simple fixes to some of these can make a big difference in terms of how others perceive the quality of the work of the child. As I said before, I always present ambiguous words in context with sentence and story examples. I rarely will teach a word in isolation unless there's a particular reason to, for the simple reason that it takes longer, and most importantly, it's not the same thing as the task of looking at an ambiguous text or an ambiguous sentence and figuring out the meaning or resolving the ambiguity if you're working at a lower level in isolation. So always do it in context. That's it. I can't recommend these articles enough. I found actually there was a lot of really interesting research around homonyms and homophones. I also saw that there was a bit of a divergence between some of the neuroscience and developmental language disorder kind of literature and some of the education literature. The Norbury article is excellent, as is the Henderson article. As always, if you've got any questions about anything that I've talked about in this little presentation, please let me know. You can contact me at hello@banterspeech.com.au or give us a call. I hope that you found this useful. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.